Okay, great. Well, hello, everybody. My name is James Bullock. I'm the Dean of the School of Physical Sciences here at UC Irvine. And I'd like to welcome you all to Compelling Conversations. So this activity, Compelling Conversation, is a virtual activity we've been running in the school ever since shutdown. And this is the last Compelling Conversations of the academic year. And we will let everybody know what we're going to be doing in the fall as we kind of open up and figure out how we're going to be doing events. Hopefully, we're going to be doing some more live stuff pretty soon. So Compelling Conversations is an exclusive virtual opportunity for our partners, alumni, and supporters to join a conversation with experts in the School of Physical Sciences. These are live, unscripted events where we bring in experts who are doing interesting research on related topics and just talk to each other and find out what we're all doing. I hope you'll consider supporting the kind of thing we're trying to do here. If you'd like to support us and enjoy these events, you can do so by texting to give. You can text the letters PSCC to the number 41444. And any donation, even if it's $10, actually can go a long way towards helping us do interesting and I think valuable activities. So my role in this conversation is just to sort of ask some questions and facilitate things. Today's topic is on machine learning, big data, and modeling and its role in the physical sciences. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce the panelists and then briefly, and then I'll ask them to sort of talk a little bit about how they got to this moment, what they're working on, and we'll keep going from there. Let me also mention that there is a Q&A button. Anytime you want to ask a question, just go ahead and do it, and I'll weave it in. In fact, we've got one right now. Will this be recorded? And will this recording be made available? Yes, definitely. So the same mailing list where you received information about this talk, we will let you know when the talk is posted. It will ultimately be posted on the School of Physical Sciences YouTube channel, so you can find it there in a couple days. And so, yeah, so that's that. So let me go ahead and introduce our panelists. So first we have Professor Francois Primo. So Francois is a professor of Earth System Science here at UC Irvine, and his interests are to develop forward and inverse numerical ocean models to analyze tracer observations and make inferences about the ocean's ability to store and transport heat and carbon. He holds a BS in Applied Mathematics from the University of Waterloo. He holds a master's degree in mathematics from the University of Alberta and a PhD in physical oceanography from MIT. Francois will also be starting as the next chair of the Earth System Science Department in July. So we are really happy to have him here representing Earth System Science. And next we have Jessica Howard. So Jessica is a PhD student in the physics and astronomy department. In particular, she studies particle physics. She holds a BS in physics and mathematics from the University of California, Davis. She's a third-year graduate student, and her research in particle physics has two main components. First, developing possible mathematical models for how our universe works, and using methods from machine learning and big data to develop tools to help test such models. So here we have a pretty interesting situation where we have Francois and Jessica who both utilize modeling, big data, machine learning, computation to understand the universe. But the scales are very, very different. Jessica is studying sort of the smallest scales in nature and looking at trying to discover new and fundamental physics about how the universe works. And Francois is studying the oceans, so very large scale ocean environments, and trying to understand things related to climate change and other important topics. So it's going to be fun to have this conversation and talk to these experts today. So what I'm going to do now is I want to ask each of you to tell us a little bit about, maybe even how you got to UCI and why you're interested in working on things now, and then we can get into it. So Francois, why don't I go ahead and have you kick it off?
Sure.
What got you into oceanography and what are you working on now?
Yep. So I ended up in oceanography by chance. I was an applied math and physics undergrad student, and I did a master's in partial differential equations. And the problem I was given by my advisor was nonlinear waves interactions. And so at that point, I had never seen the ocean. I was from Canada, and I was in Edmonton, which is far from the ocean. And I thought, this is really interesting. So, and I thought the ocean looked beautiful from a partial differential equation point of view. But then I switched to physical oceanography. And at that point, mostly because there was very little data in the kinds of modeling I was doing, and it was something missing in the problems I was working on. So switched to oceanography and became interested in larger and larger scales, from waves to global scale circulation, mostly because I was entrained by the importance of climate issues, changing climate. And from there ended up at UCI after doing a postdoc, and moving to global scale oceanography.
Great, thanks, Francois. We'll come back a little bit more to find out what you're working on now, but before that, let's hear from Jessica. So Jessica, how did you get into sort of wanting to understand particle physics? And then, how did you find yourself doing this sort of machine learning related approach to particle physics that you're doing today?
Yeah, so it's kind of a winding story, but I guess to kind of start off, this might sound pretty silly, but while I was growing up, I didn't realize that scientist could actually be a career, something that people could actually do and not just learn about in a classroom. And I loved my science classes, but I only really saw applications of science in the real world. So like engineering and industry sort of technology applications. That was all I really knew about. So it was kind of unsurprising when I entered my undergraduate institution. I entered as a mechanical engineering major, but I very soon realized that I cared more about learning more about the fundamental details of what was going on than just applying the science. And I was very fortunate that in my lower division physics classes, I had some amazing mentors who talked about their research in particle physics, and I was just hooked. The idea of trying to learn more about the fundamental details of the matter in the universe was exactly what I had been looking for, even though I didn't know the name of it yet, or at the time. And so I switched my major to physics, and I started getting involved in research. And in particle physics, there's a lot of data analysis. That's a large component of research. And so inevitably, I had to use computers and learn how to program. And I was very afraid of this at first. I had no experience at all, but I came to really enjoy it through particle physics research. And my senior research project that I was working on, I actually wound up getting exposed to machine learning as well. And I became even more fascinated by that. And machine learning is extremely cool and is very rapidly developing. But what I kind of realized is at the time, it wasn't being very well utilized in particle physics. And I was really interested in trying to pursue that direction. And so I actually specifically chose UCI for graduate school because I could tell that it was really fostering that connection between machine learning and physics. And coming here, my intuition was right, and I've had some really great opportunities. I joined a program on campus here called MAPS, which is Machine Learning in the Physical Sciences, which has just been a wonderful opportunity. And it was pretty lucky timing because unfortunately it's in its last year of funding this year. So I felt really lucky that I was here at the right time to be able to participate in it. And it really fostered connections between computer science graduate students and graduate students from the physical sciences in other departments. And some really cool research has come out of this. So I guess that's kind of a story of how I got here. And And I'm just interested in continuing on this sort of using machine learning to learn more about the universe.
Great. That's so fascinating. Yeah, I think this program and more this ability to kind of bring different physical scientists together and also computer scientists together to try to figure out how to utilize these new powerful tools is something that's really beginning to change multiple fields. And I think at some level the wave is breaking right now, and we don't know exactly how it's going to play out, but it's definitely breaking. And I think we're all trying to get ready for that as time goes on.
Okay.
Hey, John. Hey, everybody. I think that John Lonegrub is now joining us. Hey, John, can you hear me? I don't know. John, can you hear me? Okay. As John is joining, why don't I turn it back to Francois? So Francois, I know that, why don't you tell us a little bit about the problems and the kind of work that you're working on these days? I know, for example, that we're aware of this idea that humans are putting a lot of excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and this is driving climate change right now. But of course, the ocean plays a really fundamental role because it's a sink for carbon dioxide. It absorbs carbon dioxide, but I know that is one of the major questions right now: how much and to what extent, and the rates, et cetera. Can you tell us a little bit about that problem and your research and how it relates to that important question?
Sure. I guess on the physics side, the major rate limiting step for taking CO2 out of the atmosphere into the ocean. So the CO2 will dissolve, but then very quickly the surface ocean would become saturated in equilibrium with the atmosphere. So what's important is that there's these overturning currents that circulate on timescales of thousands of years that bring the surface waters to the depth and then back to the surface. And it's that kind of renewal of older waters that haven't seen the climate change yet, bringing those back to the surface that allows a continual drawdown of the atmospheric CO2. Now it's a really difficult modeling, a challenge in fluid dynamics to simulate the ocean, because it has scales ranging from centimeter scales where there's turbulence all the way up to the global overturning circulation. And if you try to simulate that on a computer, you would need very, very high resolution, which would limit you to very short simulation times. But yet we need to know about the century and millennial timescales to be able to interpret the patterns of carbon in the ocean and oxygen and temperature and salinity. And so this is where the data comes in my research, is that we are forced to have these coarse models that cannot simulate all the small scale turbulence. And so we try to infer the fluxes of momentum between different cells in our model by inferring what they must have been to produce the patterns of the things we do observe. So we have these satellites that measure the surface of the ocean, and they produce loads of data. And we have these autonomous robots, these drifters that float around and take continuous profiles. And through telemetry, we bring back these data in big databases. And then our work is to combine these disparate sources of data to try to constrain directly the fluxes of momentum that will give us the circulation that is consistent with all of the observations and allows us to predict the future and interpret what's going on in the ocean. So, and it's interesting also because there's not just the physics of the ocean circulation, but there's also biological activity happening in the ocean. So there's phytoplankton growing at the surface. They take up CO2 and then they sink down through the water column, and then microbes respire them. And so there's kind of a pump of carbon from the surface ocean and the atmosphere into the deep ocean. And as the climate is changing, that is going to affect the return flow of nutrients and carbon and affect the biological drawdown. And so it's a complicated problem to sort out how things are going. So my research is to combine the observations, the numerical models, and figure out ways to solve interpret the equations in a finite amount of computing time. Even on big supercomputers, it's hard to get solutions. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I'm really interested in that question. I mean, you were talking about phytoplankton, and as I recall, Francois, you were involved in a study within the last year or so that actually concluded that it might be that the phytoplankton levels may be going up, at least in certain parts of the ocean in response to climate change. And that was a little bit unexpected. Is that right? Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it wasn't, I guess, certain parts of the ocean, the phytoplankton were going up in the Southern Ocean mostly, but for the rest of the world's ocean, they were going down dramatically. So there was a huge decline in the population of phytoplankton because of the return flow. So when the deep water mass is up, well, they bring back nutrients. And in the future climate, the simulations are predicting that the ocean will become more stratified, so warmer at the surface, and the deep ocean haven't warmed yet. And that's going to slow down the rate of overturning. And so there would be kind of catastrophic drops in phytoplankton productivity, everything north maybe of, I don't know, 60 south or so, or 40 degrees south of latitude, and a dramatic increase south of there. And one thing that was really surprising is that it would be the balance of things was that these regions where there's not much oxygen in the ocean presently would have shrunk. Everybody's predicting that they will be growing because of slower overturning rate and less oxygenations, less oxygen coming from the atmosphere to deep ocean, which would be a serious problem for fish in the ocean. But the simulations seem to have them shrinking, and that's what got us going on this research. We were trying to figure out why would these oxygen minimum be shrinking instead of expanding in a warmer world. Yeah, so it was kind of exciting. These were simulations, so now we have to try to sort out if these things will pan out or not, or how they will go. Yeah.
Oh, fascinating. So if people have questions about any of the topics we're raising, please go ahead and ask them in the box. But let me just take this opportunity. John, thanks for joining us. I'll
Sure.
introduce you now to everyone. So everybody, this is Professor John Lowengrub. He's a Chancellor's Professor of Mathematics, but he's also a Professor of Biomedical Engineering and a Professor of Chemical Engineering and Computer Science. His work is incredibly broad, and as an applied mathematician, he applies his techniques and approaches to lots of interesting questions. He holds a BA in mathematics from Cornell and a PhD in applied mathematics from the Quran Institute of Mathematical Sciences. He's also one of the PIs for the UCI Center for Cancer Systems Biology. And the topic there is to understand the principles that underlie why cancers are organized the way they are. And, listening to Francois talking about the huge scales over which, the ocean models have to think about, from centimeters to sort of the size of the ocean, that's a similar issue that you're dealing with in sort of biological simulations, where you're talking about going from cells to tumors and other things. So John, tell us a little bit about, what your trajectory was and what got you into using, as becoming an applied mathematician, and the kind of problems that you're interested in today at UCI.
So thanks very much. Sorry, I was running a little late to get here, but where I've, came from was basically from a very mathematical viewpoint, where what I tried to do was analyze the equations that are governing physical principles. And so I started with fluid dynamics and moved more to material science. And as my career progressed, and then one of the reasons I came to UCI is there's very strong interactions between mathematics and biology. And when I came in 2003, that initiative was just kind of getting started. And so, and that really attracted me here. And the interactions, I would say, between mathematics and biology at UCI are the deepest probably of any university in the country. And so we have intimate connections, and where we're continually developing mathematical models that are integrating, processes across wide range of scales, ranging from the gene or gene regulatory networks all the way up to tissues and how the cells are interacting in the tissues. And so where the mathematical models come in is trying to understand how these nonlinear processes are integrated. And experimentation is somewhat limited in the depth in which one can probe the interactions between the scales, but mathematics provides the tool for doing so. And so that really got me into this field. And now basically, to make further progress, we've been pushing the mathematical side, so in particular multi-scale modeling, so integrating these processes across the scales. as well as designing new experiments and using the modeling to direct where the new experiments should be performed in order to validate the model or invalidate the model, or at least test the model predictions. And then what I've been doing is using this idea for modeling cancer. And so really what we want to do is ultimately be able to help cure patients with cancer, but using mathematical models and models that have integrated the biological data in a rigorous way. And so that's my role, and that's how my career has kind of developed since I've been at UCI.
Thanks so much, John.
So we have a big effort for this. So for example, as Dean Bullock mentioned, we have this U54 Center for Cancer Systems Biology that's sponsored by the National Cancer Institute. And this, together with our Center for Complex Biological Systems, has been a source of integrating systems biology, which is really mathematics, computation, and engineering principles, and applying them to biology, and in particular cancer.
Thanks. I mean, I think what's so neat about this group right here is we've got, John, who's talking about this really integrative approach to tackling problems in biology, including, obviously important questions about cancer. Francois, who's looking at sort of global warming related issues with the ocean. And then Jessica is studying the fabric of the universe itself and fundamental particles and new laws of physics. And so it's sort of interesting how data science and computation and machine learning has kind of become sort of this pillar for science, really, in much the same way that, I think traditionally we think of sort of analytic mathematics and experiment as being sort of two key pillars of science. I do think that these days there's now a third pillar, which is related to computation and really data science that is sort of a third way of thinking about things. How does that, I don't know, I sort of threw that out there. Do you, any of you three agree with that this is actually sort of like a third thing now that is a little bit distinct either from sort of pure theory or pure experiment in the world of science? I'm just going to leave that there and for anyone to comment on if you want.
It certainly is in my field. Lots of the quote unquote experiments we do are numerical simulation of climate under various scenarios. And then we try to take apart the big data that's produced as model output to figure out what's going on. So simulation and the data produced is a big part of our research field in climate sciences. Yeah, so that's definitely true.
And for my field as well. So again, the models are highly nonlinear, highly complex. And so really to access them, you have to use numerical simulations. And especially from the fact that you have to, there's both theory into going to the numerical simulations, so designing the best algorithms, the most efficient algorithms, and then also trying to infer basically how the results actually compare to the experimental data. So that's another piece of computation, which is, for example, parameter inference and quantifying uncertainty, because the models are uncertain, the data is uncertain, there's measurement errors. And so not only do we have the traditional like forward solving approaches where we would develop a model and predict what would happen, but we have to say, well, we know what happens in our biological systems. Is there parameter regimes, or are there certain regimes in which the model is validated, but you need to take into account the fact that you don't know everything? And so now there's new methodologies that actually combine statistics with this large scale computation. And that really is, one can think of this as a kind of data-driven approach to computation. So not only is it designing the forward algorithm to predict what happens, but also an inverse algorithm to try to say, well, how would you match the data and what parameter ranges, and in other words, what kind of features of the model do you need to have to match the data? And that also tells you a lot of information, but there's a lot of uncertainty, and so you have to account for that as well. So that's kind of a novel idea.
So this reminds me a lot of the kind of work that Jessica's doing, and we actually have a question here, Jessica, and maybe you can weave this in. The question is, where do you get the data for what you're trying to do? So maybe talk a little bit about that. But I know this is sort of in particle physics, sort of a key question. How do you test the standard model with data that you don't really understand your detector that well? These kind of questions. Maybe you can sort of tell us a little bit about what you're doing in that space.
Yeah, absolutely. So so particle physics is somewhat in a unique situation where the amount of data that we collect is like astronomical. Like there's so much of it. This one. This is a picture actually of a detector event at the LHC, and the data that comes out of this, the number of events, it's petabytes per second. It's an insane amount of data, and we actually wind up throwing a lot of it away just because we can't store it fast enough. So we only keep the most interesting pieces of it. But even with all of that data, we're still struggling to really test our current model of how particle physics works. It's holding up, I guess, a lot. It's holding up very well, but not as well as we would have hoped. There's signs that it's not a complete model, but it is doing very well at predicting a lot of these things. And so there's a lot of efforts going into data collection, but one very interesting aspect when you have this much data to work with is you really have to be careful with how you statistically analyze the data, because there's so much of it, you run the risk of reading too much into very minor statistical fluctuations. And it's actually very, very difficult to do this. So in addition to all of the data that we collect, we actually rely very heavily on simulations of these detector responses. Essentially, we look at or we simulate what a particle collision would look like, assuming the standard model is completely accurate. And then we throw in new physics plus the standard model and simulate what that would look like in our data. And we compare the two in very statistically rigorous ways. But we're really kind of running up against a wall where we're looking and we're not seeing any disagreement so far. And so we're really trying to turn over every stone and use every tool at our disposal. So as a field, we've always had statistics and data analysis sorts of methods at play. But now the way that I see it is machine learning is really becoming this extra tool to add to our toolbox that has been extremely powerful in both data analysis and also improving the speed and efficiency of these simulations that we rely so heavily on.
Right. So, I mean, the one thing that's interesting about what you said, and maybe it sounded odd to some of the audience, but I think it's especially in particle physics, correct me if I'm wrong, the real hope is that the theory is wrong. You have the theory and you want to prove it wrong. The dream scenario is the predictions don't match the data because that means you've discovered new physics somehow, right? And, I think and even slightly more applied scenarios, you want your model to be correct because then it'll allow you to predict these other things that you want to understand. Whereas in particle physics, I think more than almost any other field, people really want the model to be wrong and figuring out. And the thing that's sort of frustrating about the standard model of particle physics is it's incredibly, it's doing pretty well, I think. Am I right about that?
Yeah, essentially the way I think about it is we're really trying to stress test our best model at the moment. And the reason why we are very much excited about the possibility of it being wrong is because we already know that it's wrong. There are experimental measurements that we can't explain within the framework. So we know it's not complete, but we're struggling to kind of get a foothold in how to improve it.
Yeah, you need that. You need to figure out in a micro scale what's actually not working. Yes. So you work. Yeah, I get it. So we have a question here for John. So John, Nancy Evans is asking, do you work primarily on tumor cancers or as opposed to blood cancers, or both, or tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so we're working on both. As part of our U54 Cancer Systems Biology Center, I'm working personally on blood cancers there for chronic, one of them is chronic myeloid leukemia, in addition to solid cancer. So our cancer center, so our Cancer Systems Biology Center, we also have a comprehensive cancer center here. So I'll say a little bit about both of those. But first, for our Cancer Systems Biology Center, where I'm directly involved with the mathematical modeling and specific projects, we have 2 projects on solid cancers. So one on colon cancer and one on melanoma. And then a third project is on blood cancer, and that's chronic myeloid leukemia. And so on the blood cancer, even though it's blood, there could be potentially a spatial component because it's already, this as well as other CML as well as other blood cancers are originating in the bone marrow and dealing with stem cells. And so what we're really trying to understand is how the nonlinear interactions between the different cell types in the bone marrow, and when there's a mutation, for example, a mutation in what's called the Philadelphia chromosome, and that's what generates CML, chronic myeloid leukemia. And so we're trying to understand why, how the disease progresses as it does, and why, for example, in CML, there's very good treatments available called tyrosine kinase inhibitors. They're very good. That's like the first cure of cancer. They're at least coming from molecular biology. But what our interest is when patients have to be on these treatments for life, and there's very strong evidence. For example, been studies that show at 40, perhaps even more % of patients, if they're removed from these inhibitor treatments, the disease will recur. And so we think that's because the disease is not hitting, or the treatment is not hitting the malignant stem cells, and they can reproduce themselves and so regenerate the disease. In addition, there's a small percentage, about 10%, maybe as much as 15% of patients that never respond to this treatment. And the question is why? And so we're trying to unravel the mysteries of this disease using mathematical modeling that's accounting for nonlinear interactions between the different cells and how they're communicating in the bone marrow to try to predict how a patient would respond and how one should modify therapy to improve response. So improve response both when the patient is taken off the treatment, or how to get the patient to respond initially. And so, yes, we look at both types of cancers. In the comprehensive cancer center that we have at UCI, which is consisting of cancer biologists, clinicians, systems biologists, engineers, all working together on cancer, there's a lot of different cancers that people are looking at. So our comprehensive cancer center basically does fundamental research on cancer and then tries to translate that research to the clinic. And that is both solid cancers and liquid cancers or blood cancers.
So John, one of the things that's always strikes me about you in particular is you're very fluent in the sort of bioscience, the biology piece of it. And obviously you've been working on it for a while. But my understanding is that the students that you and your colleagues work with are sometimes coming from maybe the field of mathematics or applied mathematics, and sometimes they're coming with an expertise in biology or engineering or whatever. Can you talk a little bit about how you create that interdisciplinary? How do you train everybody up into sort of all of the different subfields so that then they can work together and apply their, their own skill sets?
So that's a great question. And so exactly that problem led us to develop a new degree program in mathematical, computational, and systems biology. And so that started as a gateway program in 2005 or 2006, right around there. So that means that students come in for 1 year and they take both mathematics, biology, computer science, statistics courses, physics also. There's a course in there from physics, and they become fluent in the language of both mathematics, at least from my perspective, or the quantitative sciences, and biology. And so we view that as a kind of an integral part of their training. And then in the Gateway program, after this first year where they come in as a cohort and they learn the quantitative and the biology together, and they learn how to, the most important part of this first year of the program is they learn how to communicate. They learn as much of the language as they can, as well as we try to impress upon them how different people think. So for example, if a student comes to my group, then I connect them with biologists and they sit together and we see, and when we discuss, we explain how these different viewpoints can be meshed. And this is a big challenge, especially between going from the quantitative to the biological side, where really what you need to be able to do is communicate, everything. Communication is key. And so as mathematicians, we are obligated, if we want to do this work, to learn the important ways of, or basically the important biological descriptions, and to get as versed in the biology as we can, while maintaining our strengths in the mathematics and computational modeling. For my particular group, it's different for engineers, but the fundamental thing is the same, which is that how do you communicate? And so the way we do that is through classes and through rotations. So for example, in our program, students will go and they spend a quarter working in the group or laboratory of a faculty member. And in our program, independent of whether they want to do, for example, dry or quantitative thesis or an experimental thesis, they have to go to labs of both. And by sitting in the lab, they are immersed in that culture, and so they have to learn how to communicate within it. And now over the last few years, we've expanded this program to also grant degrees, so PhD degrees and master's degrees. In the mathematics department, we've had a number of students transfer from this program into mathematics, fewer in physics. There's been a couple in chemistry. So I'm director of this program, and I've been the director since this PhD or program has initiated. I wasn't the director for the Gateway program when that came about, but I was heavily involved in it. And this is the key thing for how we train our students. So we have to train them to be interdisciplinary. And so interdisciplinary is really different from multidisciplinary. So if you have a project that's multidisciplinary, then you have people from different disciplines and they're talking. Interdisciplinary, for what our students are doing, means that these students can directly talk and directly interact with, they know both, right? They know their area, and they know the biology, at least in our case, for which they're going to apply it. And that comes over time, but that comes through programs like this where they learn both together. And so that's how we train the students. It's a really,
and it's so amazing then the kind of discoveries that come out of that kind of approach. And so let me actually, thinking about this interdisciplinary approach, multidisciplinary approach, really, I want to ask Francois now to put on your soon-to-be chair hat and talk a little bit about the Department of Earth System Science, because I think that department, your department, was built from the ground up with that kind of attitude in mind. And so maybe say a little bit about what you're doing in your department more generally in this interdisciplinary space.
Yeah, so it was interesting to listen to John, how they can train the student. We have the same kind of problem in our department, maybe even worse, because we go from non-quantitative biologists to people who study radiation in the atmosphere, and we try to get them to learn about the Earth as a system. But at the same time, they have to be able to focus on the details of their specific thesis topic. So it's a challenge, but I think that's what makes our field interesting, is that you can learn chemistry, biology, and physics. If you like science, Earth system science is a great place for that. Then there's the whole multitude of aspects that come into it. And I guess in terms of collaboration, it's very often that there'll be some links between different professors who understand a problem together, and then there will be sort of kind of forms of chains of subgroups. Nobody understands the full system as a whole, and it's challenging in terms of coming up with curriculum and training the students, but it's also exciting. Yeah. I guess I wanted to make a comment to about John's point about interdisciplinary. I had the opportunity to work with Professor Natalia Komarova. I don't know if she's in the systems biology one. Me and Professor Martini were talking to her. We were on a joint grant to understand evolution of plankton in the ocean. And it's a challenging problem because they're living in one environment, but the currents move them around and they experience different environment. And she was relating to us that that's very similar to cancer, blood cancers that we were talking about, where the cancer cells move through the circulation system of people. So it was exciting to me to see that the same types of problems appear at very different situations.
Yeah, and also metastasis is another example of that. So for example, where a tumor arises in one area and then metastasizes through the blood system to another area, and it's a completely different environment. And so there's a question of what's driving those cells to move, and then what is it about that host environment that supports those cells to grow. And metastasis in terms of cancer is the most challenging problem of all, because that's the hardest to cure. And so it's very much like that. They born in one place and they decide to move for whatever reason. And then when they go to another place and they establish a foothold, then it's very hard to treat.
Yes.
And why does that happen?
Right. So
why are there specific organs? Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. Say similar problems in terms of climate change. As the climate is changing, if we want to predict how the biological pump I was talking about earlier, how the phytoplankton take up CO2, the environment is changing, but they live on timescales of a day or so they can evolve very quickly. And people don't know how the future will be if the environment is different and the biology is behaving differently. It's a fundamental challenge of fluid dynamics, how they move around, how the fluids will move, and how the plankton will evolve or not, or differently. It's exciting, but it's very complicated. Yeah.
And Francois, you were using, at least I think, the phytoplankton study that I was referring to earlier. You were using sort of a neural network derived quantitative niche model to try to, I think, grapple with some of these things. Is that correct?
Yeah. So also there was a different study. Yeah. So there was a study with Professor Martini. The same one we were talking with Professor Komarova. So that study, they had taken some ship tracks and collected data all over the world, and then they used some neural network technology. So I wasn't intimately involved in the neural network aspect of it, but since we don't really know at a fundamental level what causes these phytoplankton to live where they will and how they will change, they had used this neural network and then try to extrapolate to the global ocean to see how the system may respond to a warmer ocean or different nutrient loading in the future. And so we have different environments with different temperatures, different populations of phytoplankton, and different environments. And we train the neural networks in where we have different data, and then we use it to extrapolate in space or in time. So that's a big area where machine learning is is being used, and we're experimenting and trying to figure out what works, what doesn't work. It's exciting times. Where it will end up, I'm not sure.
Yeah. Well, Jessica, you are one of these students who's more or less participating in one of these multidisciplinary programs between computer science and physical sciences right now. And I wonder what your, as someone who's sort of going through it and is really at the interface, I think, between these fields, what is that like? And I can ask, what's it like as a physics PhD student interacting with the kinds of questions and problems that maybe they ask from a more data science perspective? And is that different? Do you change the way you think about problems? I mean, what's your personal experience in that kind of space?
Yeah, definitely listening to John talk about the interdisciplinary and the fact that communication is key. I can definitely echo that is absolutely the case. When you have two different fields and people are trying to work on the same project, there's a lot of effort needs to be done to communicate and really make sure everyone's on the same page. What are the goals? What are the capabilities? And really just trying to establish this common language to talk about things. And so personally, I feel like I've had to really learn both machine learning and particle physics, and have my feet in both of these worlds, and really try to navigate acting as a bridge to really communicate the physical science problems and constraints to computer scientists, and also the limitations of different machine learning methods to physicists. But overall, it's been a really fun problem to have. So I've really enjoyed it.
I have two questions for you that I don't want to forget to ask. So I'm going to go ahead and do it now. But if other people have questions that are watching, please jump in. So the first question I have for you is this. When you're a particle physicist, you are fundamentally, like, the goal, I think one of the goals of what you're trying to do is understand why the universe is doing this, in some sort of human, in a human way, like you personally or the people you talk to understand why particles behave the way they do and clump together the way they do, or whatever. And oftentimes machine learning algorithms don't really care about why. That they're sort of like, somewhere in the networks, they know that when the data, input comes in, answer comes out, and it's correct. And there's not a lot of thought about what's going on in that box. The machine has just figured it out, and they know how to take this input and give you the output. But you want to know the box. I mean, that's kind of why a lot of people are driven to science, because they want to know why. How do you think about that? And what's the progress like, I guess, from a sort of physics point of view, of that why piece, of opening that box and understanding what the machine learning algorithm is learning in a more sort of like human way?
Yeah, absolutely. So exactly, as physicists, we really care about learning the why, and so a lot of computer scientists are also, particularly those who apply computer science methods to physical sciences, are becoming much more concerned with really interpreting what the network has learned, and making these models more understandable. And I guess personally, we've done that with one project where we were trying to get better at classifying data, different types of data that we observe, from things that we want to see, and things that we don't want to see, that we don't really care about, that aren't interesting to us in the data. And this type of classification problem is very common, a very common thing that particle physicists do in data analysis. And there's been a lot of efforts of people using machine learning to make these classification algorithms much more efficient, and they get fantastic results. But ideally, we want to know what exactly it's picking up on, just to help us understand better. And so in the project that I'm referring to, what we did was we actually translated what the machine had learned into these human interpretable variables. There's been some work that kind of characterized a universal basis for expressing a lot of these things, but it's huge, it's infinite dimensional. And so essentially we used the machine learning algorithm to narrow down what variables in this space are very important, and we're able to actually learn something from those.
Well, we have a question here from Jonathan Lukoff, who's asking something that maybe we should have addressed some time ago, which is, what is it about machine learning, that the advances in machine learning, what's so special about that? What does that allow us to do that you couldn't do in sort of other ways? What kinds of problems is machine learning particularly good at, and what is it doing? Maybe that's a really simple way to start. I don't know, Jessica, if you want to tackle that, or Francois, or whoever wants to do it.
Yeah, I've been talking a lot, but I'd be happy to comment on.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So machine learning is somewhat of an enigma that has kind of come out really in full force in the last decade, and so its capabilities are very far-reaching, and new capabilities are getting discovered every day, truly. And so it's everything from classifying images to translating languages to self-driving cars to just there's a lot of different areas that it can cover. And really the one of the fundamental reasons why this is a specific type of machine learning is based on these neural networks, artificial neural networks. And these are extremely flexible sorts of function. They can essentially approximate any sort of function in a mathematical sense. And so if you think, for example, about a classification problem as your network is trying to learn to classify cats from dogs, given some sort of input, that mapping is just a very complicated function that we wouldn't really be able to program ourselves. And so we would very much struggle to program ourselves. And so the reason why machine learning is so powerful is it's a systematic way to train a machine to perform some task that so allows us to get these sorts of function mappings that we wouldn't be able to program ourselves. So we don't know how to program the solution, but we can program the computer to discover the solution for itself.
Thanks. That was amazing. That was really well put. And I think, maybe that relates back to the question I asked, which maybe, I should have asked it after that, which was, so now the computer knows these functions, but, as a physicist, you want to know the functions and you want to know what that means in some other understandable way, and not just that there's a black box with functions that goes from these pixels to a way to tell you it's a cat. You kind of want to know something a little bit different. But okay, one more quick question for you, Jessica, we have one more question here that popped up. If you're throwing away most of the data that's produced, how do you know you're not throwing away the baby with the bathwater? How do you know which data to keep if you are throwing most of it away?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question, and it's really all a game of statistics. So the interesting things that we're looking for are very rare. So they do not happen that often. So we kind of know from the get-go that the majority of the stuff that we're going to be getting is data that we already know it matches our model. We don't really care about it. So that's kind of an underlying assumption that goes into this. And so there's a lot of work on these sorts of experiments to design what are called triggers. So they look for very incriminating information in the data that they can process very quickly to kind of say, yes, this is an interesting event, or no, it's not an interesting event. And so it's a very delicate process, and one that probably does have a lot of errors in it. But overall, it's kind of the best that we can do.
Thanks a lot. So listen, everybody, we've only got about 4 minutes left, and I want to give a chance and ask a little bit of an open-ended question from Francois and John, since we've just heard from Jessica. What are you most excited about, or what do you see in the horizon in this sort of space of sort of modeling and big data in your subfield over the next, I don't know, 5-10 years? Like what is the exciting and important sort of development that you're looking towards, over the next sort of 5 to 10 years? Let me ask Francois to take a stab at that. Very open-ended.
Right. So, I mean, one of the applications that people in my department are working on, Professor Pritchard, is they're using numerical simulations to simulate turbulence in clouds. And then they save the data, and then they apply a machine learning algorithm to simulated data. And they're trying to then have a more efficient way of computing the small scale turbulence. And that poses, he was telling me, some challenges, because there's no guarantee that the emulator is going to be a stable scheme to go forward. And for climate simulations, you need to run the model a long time. So if that could be successful, it may be a breakthrough and be able to simulate or emulate very small scale physics that we have no hope of putting up on these supercomputers. So that's one area that's kind of exciting. Other areas is to quickly process remote sensing data. So there's this explosion of satellite-based data that looks at the surface of the ocean and the land, and to extract to monitor and extract what's going on. A human looking at it would take forever, but the machine learning algorithms will presumably make these things much, much better. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I can't wait for that. John, what about you? I'm sure you're going to cure cancer for us next year, right? Is that the...
Yeah, sure. So I think, actually one of the most exciting areas, I think, is very similar to what Francois described in his. So we, in particular, as I mentioned, tying the models to the data. And so that involves a forward model to be able to predict forward what's going to happen given a set of circumstance. But the question is, for those circumstance, how do we predict what those are? So in other words, those are you could think of those as the parameters in the model that are describing a particular cancer or particular tissue. And so that's an inverse problem. So you would see, for example, you would see the biological observation. And then the question is, how did you get to that biological observation? And so doing that, so that's an inverse problem. How do you go backwards thinking about the model and using the model and iterating back and forth? And so that requires a very fast evaluation for a very complicated system, because you typically solve these things by iterations. So you have to do multiple steps to do it. And so if your forward solver is slow, it's very difficult to basically compare or get a correspondence between the biological data and your numerical parameters in the model that are describing all the different processes and how they're interacting together. And so one of the real advances, and there's still quite a ways to go, is again to use machine learning as an accelerator. So as a kind of emulator for your physical system that you've derived using mathematics, but then you train your machine learning emulator or your neural network emulator on your mathematical model. And if you can do that in a way that is predictive, so in other words, what the advantage of the mathematical model is that once you've given the parameters, the model will tell you what happens. I mean, it may be deterministic or there may be some randomness in it, but it will tell you on average what's happening. And that will start from any initial condition. Whereas when you have machine learning algorithm, if you give it something that's outside its training set, it can have problems. And so that's why it's a big challenge to use a machine learning algorithm to emulate a physical model, because the physical model will work in any type of regime that you give it, but the machine learning may not. And so that's a big challenge, but that's a great and very important direction, because those emulators may be much and have been proven to be much, much faster. And that's what you need to solve the inverse problem. Another key is to try to integrate more and more data that is being collected biologically, particularly at the individual cell level. And so how can you integrate all of this information to say what's happening on a tissue scale? That is super exciting. There's partial answers, but that's a really important direction for the future.
Wow. Okay. Well, with that, I think we've learned that things are just starting to progress. And I think we are going to see all of these amazing techniques play out and really push the future of discovery over the next several years. I want to thank the three of you for joining us today and sharing your expertise. I want to thank all the attendees as well. And I hope you have a wonderful summer. And we will see everyone back either in person or virtually or some version of that in the fall. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.